Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that still makes my hands tremble. Not from anger anymore, but from the memory of how people can underestimate quietness. You probably won't survive this story emotionally if you've ever been mocked for being simple, old-fashioned, or too humble. Because that's exactly what I was called. A simple old man. My son-in-law said it in front of everyone, half joking, half cutting, deep enough to draw invisible blood. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to watch the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. I share stories that come from the small corners of life where people think no one is watching. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's comfortably embark on tonight's journey. It was an ordinary Saturday. My daughter insisted on hosting a family dinner at her new house. She had just married 3 months earlier, and everything about that place screamed of her husband's taste, sleek, metallic, and unnecessarily expensive. Even the cutlery looked like it had its own mortgage. I brought my usual homemade pickles and a small basket of fruit. Simple things, the kind I believe carry the warmth of effort, not price tags. When I entered, he greeted me with a smile so polished it squeaked. "Ah, the famous father-in-law," he said, clapping my back too firmly. "We've got the wine. Don't worry. You can keep your fruit safe." Everyone laughed lightly, but I caught the smirk hiding beneath his charm. That was the first scratch on the surface. As dinner went on, the conversation drifted toward business, and success stories his mostly. He spoke about profits, deals, and old systems that no longer work. At one point, he looked directly at me and said, "You know, in today's world, being too humble doesn't pay off. It's survival of the smartest." The room chuckled again, as if his words were coated in sugar. I smiled back, quietly spooning more soup into my bowl. My daughter tried to change the subject, but his ego needed one more victory. "No offense, sir," he continued, "but the older generation doesn't get how fast things move now. It's a different era. You can't just sit and wait for blessings." "No offense," he said, as if that softened the blade. I remember looking around the table, the flicker of the chandelier lights on their faces, my daughter's forced smile, my wife's uneasy silence. The warmth of the soup suddenly turned bitter. That moment reminded me of something I'd once read about inheritance customs in old Japanese families. The eldest son-in-law was often expected to prove his worth by demonstrating humility before being trusted with family matters. People still debate whether that tradition was fair or outdated, but I've always thought it made sense. Because pride, if left unchecked, eats more than wealth, it devours decency. So I laughed not out of humor, but out of defense. "You're right," I said gently. "Maybe I am too simple for this world, but simplicity has its way of surviving storms. The loudest trees fall first." He tilted his head, confused, then grinned. "Well, let's hope your tree has good roots." The others laughed, not realizing what had just been exchanged. It wasn't conversation, it was declaration. A quiet war had started, and I was no longer just an old man in their story. After dessert, while everyone lingered in the living room, I offered to wash the dishes. My daughter protested, but I insisted. It's what I've always done, to show gratitude in small actions. When I stood at that sink, my hands in warm water, I thought about how life tests us not with big battles, but with small humiliations. You don't realize the cut until it starts to sting later. And standing there, I decided I wouldn't retaliate with anger. No, I would wait. The simple old man would wait until the noise around him quieted enough for truth to echo back. That night, as I left their house, my son-in-law escorted me to the door. "Drive safe, sir," he said in a tone so sweet it almost dripped sarcasm. Next time, maybe I'll show you how I trade stocks you could learn a thing or two. I looked him in the eye and smiled faintly. And maybe next time, I replied, I'll show you how I sleep peacefully without them. He didn't know it, but that was the first seed of retaliation. Not the kind built on revenge, but on patience. The kind my generation learned by living through scarcity, through loss, through nights when money couldn't buy peace. I've seen people like him before, men who confuse volume with strength. They speak loudly, but they can't hear their own emptiness. As I drove home that night, the air smelled of coming rain. The clouds were heavy, almost thoughtful. My wife was quiet beside me, her hands clasped together. Finally, she asked, "Did you have to answer him like that?" I smiled softly. If I didn't, he would think I had nothing left to teach. When we reached home, I sat on the porch and listened to the drizzle starting to fall. It reminded me of something my father used to say. You don't need thunder to prove it's raining. In family dynamics, respect is like rain's silent necessary and easy to take for granted until it stops falling. My son-in-law hadn't realized yet that when rain stops, drought begins. That dinner changed more than just the air between us. It marked the shift from being loved to being tolerated, from being listened to being humored. And in that shift, something inside me hardened, not out of hate, but out of quiet resolution. The world had turned fast, yes, but it would turn again. And when it did, I'd be waiting simple as ever, but unbroken. The following week, I went back to my quiet routines, the morning walk through the old neighborhood, the stop at the cafe where the waiter still called me sir, even though he was older than my son-in-law. I liked those small constants. They reminded me that respect doesn't come from luxury, it comes from consistency. People forget that wealth fades, but habits, especially humble ones, stay rooted. I wasn't a poor man, far from it. I just didn't need to wear my wealth on my sleeve the way my son-in-law wore his arrogance. He thought simple meant broke. He had no idea that behind my weathered hands and plain shirts sat years of quiet accumulation, all built without shouting about it. I started my small construction company 3 decades ago. Back then, we repaired what others thought was unfixable leaky roofs, cracked walls, storm-damaged homes. Nothing glamorous, but every nail carried the weight of someone's trust. Slowly, I saved. I learned from older craftsmen that wealth isn't about what you earn. It's about what you keep and what you pass on. By the time my daughter got married, I had enough investments and savings to ensure our family could live comfortably for generations. But I kept it hidden, not out of pride, but out of protection. I once read that in some parts of rural India, elders never reveal their assets until they're sure. Their successors have learned humility because revealing it too early spoils character. People still debate whether that's wise or manipulative. But for me, it was just common sense. My son-in-law, however, was the kind of man who needed to be seen. Every action he took was a performance for an invisible audience. If he helped someone, he made sure everyone knew. If he bought something, he posted it before he even opened the box. He wanted applause, not respect. That's the difference between my world and his. We built legacies quietly. They build reputations loudly. One Sunday, he came over to our home with my daughter. He walked around my modest house as though touring a museum of before technology. He looked at my old radio and chuckled. "You still listen to this thing?" I nodded. "It still works, and it doesn't lie to me." He laughed like it was a joke, but I meant it. My wife offered them tea and snacks, and as they sat, he started talking about his new business, a real estate tech startup, he called it. He spoke fast with all the confidence of someone who hasn't yet met failure. "Dad," he said suddenly, using the word with artificial warmth, "you should invest with me. I'll double it in a year." I smiled politely. "What exactly are you investing in?" He explained something about digital land portfolios, cryptocurrency-backed assets, and AI-driven architecture. It all sounded like sandcastles made of fancy words. I told him I'd think about it. He mistook my patience for hesitation. "You're missing the future," he said with a grin. "You can't make money sitting under a tree waiting for fruit to fall." I looked at him and said softly, "Some trees take longer, but their fruit lasts generations." He didn't get it. He rarely did. After they left, my wife sighed. "You could have been kinder," she said. "He's trying to involve you," I smiled. "He's not involving me, he's using me. There's a difference." She stayed quiet after that because deep down she knew I was right. That night I went through my old notebooks, handwritten ledgers, land titles, savings certificates, all organized meticulously. To anyone else, it would have looked outdated. To me, it was a map of patience. Each page reminded me of what silence can build. I wasn't hoarding wealth out of greed. I was protecting it from arrogance. Because I'd seen too many families torn apart by greed disguised as ambition. When I was younger, a friend once warned me, "Never show your full hand to your family until they've shown their hearts." I didn't fully understand it back then, but now it made perfect sense. My son-in-law would have drained me dry in the name of partnership. I could already picture the day he'd lose everything and turn to me for help. I didn't wish it, but I knew it would come. The universe always finds its way to humble the proud. Weeks turned into months. My son-in-law's company grew fast, or at least he said it did. Every time we met, he had a new car, a new watch, a new story about someone big he was meeting. My daughter looked radiant, but her eyes carried the fatigue of keeping up appearances. One night, she called me quietly. "Dad," she said, "is it okay if we borrow a little for the mortgage, just until next quarter?" I asked her how much, and when she told me, I paused. "Why does he need that much?" Her voice lowered. "He says it's just to keep things flowing. It's temporary," I told her gently. "If he's using tomorrow's money to pay for today, he's already in trouble." She didn't respond, but I could hear the silence of realization on the other side. A week later, he came to my office unannounced. He sat across from me, crossing his legs the way confident men do when they want to appear casual. "Sir," he began, "I respect what you've built, even if it's small scale. But things are changing. If you want to stay relevant, you've got to move fast." I leaned back, amused. "And where exactly are you moving to?" He smiled like a salesman. "To the future, of course." I looked at him, letting the silence stretch. "Then I'll see you when the future slows down." He didn't like that, but I did. That day, as he left my office, I could tell he thought he'd won, that the simple old man had missed the bus. But what he didn't realize was that I wasn't even at the station. I was building my own road, quietly, far from the noise. And one day soon he would find himself lost and remember the man he once mocked for walking instead of running. The distance didn't happen overnight. It grew slowly, like a shadow that lengthened every time the sun went down between us. After that visit to my office, my son-in-law became scarce at family gatherings. He always had urgent meetings or client dinners. My daughter made excuses for him at first. "He's just busy," she'd say, laughing nervously as she stirred soup or passed dishes across the table. But I could see through the performance. Busyness is often the refuge of guilt. It's where people hide when they don't want to face the eyes that remind them of who they used to be. One evening, I stopped by their house unexpectedly to drop off some homemade bread. The housekeeper opened the door and her hesitation told me everything before I even stepped in. My daughter greeted me politely, but her smile was tight. "He's upstairs on a call," she said. I nodded, but I could hear the faint sound of laughter, not professional laughter, not business laughter. The kind of laughter that smells of pride, too loud, too pleased with itself. When he came downstairs, he was surprised to see me. "Oh," he said, checking his watch as if I were late to an appointment he hadn't set. "Didn't know you were coming. I told him I just brought some bread." "That's kind of you," he said, patting my shoulder lightly, like you'd pat a dog that's too old to bark. "But you really don't need to, sir. We've got everything we need." That word, everything, always sounds temporary when it's said too confidently. I smiled, left the bread, and walked out without saying much. In silence, I thought about how respect in families often fades not through conflict, but through neglect. People still debate whether modern relationships fail because of communication or ego, but I've always believed it's both too much talking without listening and too much pride to admit wrongs. Weeks turned into seasons. My son-in-law stopped visiting even on holidays. My daughter began coming alone, sometimes with the grandchildren, who had started calling me Grandpa with the old car. It was said with affection, but I could hear their father's words echoing behind it. I didn't mind. Children repeat what they're taught. It's the adults who should know better. At one family birthday party, he finally appeared again, dressed like success itself. A new luxury watch, the kind that flashes even when it shouldn't. His shoes shone like mirrors, and his smile was sharper than before. I could tell he wanted to be seen. When people like him are riding high, they need witnesses. During dinner, one of the guests, a cousin of mine, mentioned how proud I must be to have such a modern businessman in the family. He leaned back, smirking. "Well," he said, raising his glass, "I suppose every generation has to evolve. The old ways are nice stories, but they don't pay bills." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. I looked at him, then set it down quietly. "Stories," I said softly, "are the only thing that survive when bills stop getting paid." The table went silent for a heartbeat, then someone laughed awkwardly to break the tension. He smiled, but his eyes flickered with irritation. That's the thing about proud men. They can't stand to be outdone in calmness. After the party, my daughter walked me to my car. "Dad, can you please not make comments like that?" she whispered. I looked at her face, the same face I once held. As a baby, like what I asked. "He feels like you're judging him," she said. "He's under a lot of pressure." I sighed. "And I'm under none." She didn't answer. Sometimes silence hurts more than words. The months that followed were colder not just in weather, but in tone. He rarely called, rarely visited, and when he did, he treated me like background noise. I'd be sitting there and he'd talk around me, not to me. At one dinner, I overheard him telling his friends, "My father-in-law is old school, great man, but he doesn't understand real money." That phrase, real money, it stuck to me. What is real money? The kind that glitters today and vanishes tomorrow, or the kind that builds quietly and stays invisible until someone needs it? I once read that in Korean families, elders are considered the moral anchors, no matter how rich or educated the younger generation becomes. There's a cultural expectation that you bow not because they're richer or wiser, but because time itself demands respect. People still debate whether such traditions suppress individuality or preserve humility. I think they do both, and that's why they work. Without humility, families dissolve into chaos disguised as freedom. Meanwhile, I noticed subtle changes in my daughter. The laughter in her voice became thinner, the calls less frequent. I could sense the tension in her tone when she talked about finances, though she tried to hide it. I didn't press. When people are holding up walls made of lies, pressing too hard makes them crumble before they're ready. Then one afternoon, while I was pruning the garden, my wife came outside holding her phone. "He bought another car," she said, quietly scrolling through a post. There it was, a shiny black sports car with a caption about hard work paying off. I chuckled softly, more like arrogance paying up front. My wife frowned. "You shouldn't mock him." I nodded. "I'm not mocking. I'm just predicting." It's funny how life tests patience. Every insult, every dismissal he threw my way, I stored like coins in a jar, tiny reminders of why calmness was my wealth. I didn't need revenge. I needed time. Because time, when used wisely, becomes the sharpest teacher. And deep down, I knew that one day when the noise around his success faded, he would remember the simple old man he once laughed at. Because no storm lasts forever, but when it ends, it always returns to the quietest house on the street. It happened one evening at a hotel banquet that wasn't meant for me. My daughter had invited us to attend one of her husband's business networking events. I didn't want to go. At first, these gatherings always reek of pretense and overpriced perfume. But my wife insisted. "It's family," she said, pressing the freshly ironed shirt into my hands. "Just show support." I sighed and went, even though I knew I would be treated like a relic placed in a museum corner. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and false smiles. Everyone seemed to be measuring each other not in inches or years, but in bank accounts. I kept quiet, holding a glass of water, while the others clinked champagne. My son-in-law looked like a movie star that night, tailored suit, polished charm, the perfect mask of modern success. He was surrounded by investors, journalists, and admirers who clung to his every word. I could almost see his ego expanding with every nod of approval. At one point, a young man approached me curious. "Sir, are you Mr. Daniel's father?" he asked. I smiled politely. "Father-in-law," I said. His eyes widened, surprised. "Wow, you don't look like a businessman." He laughed nervously, realizing his mistake too late. My son-in-law overheard. He turned to the crowd and said, "Oh, my father-in-law, he's a traditional man. Doesn't even use online banking, but he's wise in simpler ways." Everyone chuckled. He looked at me as if expecting me to laugh along, but I didn't. I just stared at him long enough for his grin to falter slightly. It's strange how humiliation works. It doesn't hit you all at once. It seeps in slowly like cold air, finding cracks in a warm room. That night, as I watched him parading his image around, something inside me shifted. I wasn't angry. Anger burns fast and fades. No, this was colder, quieter, a decision forming in the shadows of patience. I realized then that I wouldn't waste energy defending my dignity. I would protect it with silence. After dinner, he came over, pretending to play the gracious host. "Hope you had a good time, sir," he said, patting my shoulder again, that same condescending touch. "You should meet some of these investors. Maybe they'll convince you to finally retire those old tools." I smiled faintly. Retirement comes to those who run out of purpose, not those who still build quietly. He laughed loudly, but the tremor in his hand betrayed something else, perhaps discomfort, perhaps fear. When we got home, my wife was furious, not at him, but at me. "Why didn't you say anything? You let him insult you." I shook my head. "He doesn't insult me. He exposes himself." She frowned, pacing the room. "You're too calm about everything," she snapped. "Maybe that's why he treats you like this." Her words stung, but I didn't respond. Because she wasn't wrong. My calmness frustrated people who wanted me to fight on their terms. But I've lived long enough to know that when you wrestle with pigs, you both get dirty, only one of you enjoys it. That night I went out to the porch and looked at the stars. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence that holds its breath between storms. I sat there thinking about how every generation measures strength differently. My father believed strength was in endurance. My son-in-law thought it was in dominance. But real strength, I've learned, is in control of your words, your emotions, your timing. People still debate whether silence is a virtue or cowardice. I think it's a weapon that only wise people know how to use. The next morning, I began preparing not for revenge, but for revelation. I reviewed my accounts, rechecked my investments, consolidated what I owned. Every document, every title, every share was put under a trust with my daughter's name, not his. Quietly, efficiently, without a whisper. I didn't tell her because love makes people foolish. She would have tried to fix things or reveal it prematurely. But I knew better. I had learned from watching too many men lose everything by trusting too soon. Weeks passed and the distance between us became a wall. He stopped calling altogether, which suited me fine. My daughter, however, continued to visit. She'd tell me about their trips, the parties, the new clients. I listened patiently. Occasionally, I'd drop small seeds of wisdom disguised as harmless stories. You know, I'd say in some cultures, elders would give their inheritance early, but only as a test to see if the younger ones valued gratitude or greed. She'd smile, unaware that I was describing her husband. People still debate if that's fair, she'd say. I'd nod. Fairness is a luxury, child. Character is a necessity. One afternoon, I visited my old workshop, the same one where I started my business decades ago. The walls smelled of dust and memory. My tools hung in their places like loyal soldiers waiting for orders. I ran my hand across the wooden table, smooth from years of work. That's when I decided this man, this flashy son-in-law, would not ruin the peace I built with my own calloused hands. My retaliation would not be loud or cruel. It would be quiet, methodical, inevitable. I would let time undo him. I would let his own arrogance teach him what my words could not. And when that day came, and it always comes, I would be there not as a savior, but as a mirror. He'd look at me, then and finally understand the simple old man he mocked was the same one who mastered the one skill he never could, waiting. Silence has a strange power. It doesn't shout, it doesn't argue. It just waits patiently like a mountain letting storms pass. That was my weapon now. After that humiliating night at the hotel, I spoke less, but watched more. My son-in-law's business was everywhere on social media. Billboards, interviews, news snippets. He was being called the face of modern innovation. I smiled each time I saw his picture, because behind those shining eyes I could see the arrogance growing like unchecked mold. He was moving too fast. And I'd lived long enough to know that the faster a man climbs without humility, the harder the fall when gravity remembers him. At home, I returned to my routine, the slow mornings, the newspaper on the porch, the same cup of tea brewed by my wife. Life doesn't need to be spectacular to be meaningful. I had seen decades of businessmen crash politicians, vanish friends, rise and crumble. I've learned that the world rewards noise for a moment, but remembers silence for a lifetime. That's why I waited, not out of bitterness, but to see what kind of man my daughter had truly married when comfort disappeared. People still debate whether suffering builds character or simply reveals it. I believe it does both. It carves away the mask until only truth remains. A few months later, my son-in-law came to visit again. He arrived in a brand new SUV, his sunglasses reflecting the whole street. He handed me a bottle of imported whiskey like it was an offering to the gods. "For you, sir," he said cheerfully. "The finest there is." I took it and smiled. "I don't drink whiskey," I said softly. Too bitter for me? He chuckled. You should try it. It's acquired taste. I replied, so is humility. He didn't get it. He rarely did. We sat in the living room. My wife made tea. My daughter hovered nearby, nervous, sensing tension. He started talking about his new expansion plan. We're going international, he said, proudly, tapping his chest. This will make us 10 times bigger. I'm bringing investors from Dubai, maybe even Singapore. I nodded, letting him brag. You should join me, sir, he added. You have old money, let me show you how to make it new. His words hung in the air like perfume that turns sour after a moment. I smiled faintly. Old money, I said. Funny how the old never brags about being new. He leaned forward, his tone shifting. You know, sir, sometimes being too cautious means missing opportunity. I stirred my tea slowly. And sometimes, I said, it means avoiding disaster. He laughed politely, but his eyes darted away. For all his confidence, he couldn't handle stillness. That's the problem with people who live in noise. They can't survive silence. After they left, my wife asked, Why won't you help him? He's trying to include you. I shook my head. He's not including me. He's searching for another ladder before the one he's standing on breaks. She frowned, but she didn't argue. She'd begun to notice the cracks, too. Weeks later, I heard whispers from an old friend who worked at a local bank. Your son-in-law's company is borrowing heavily, he said discreetly. Over-leveraged, I'd say. I thanked him and said nothing. The next time my daughter visited, I asked how things were going. Her smile trembled slightly. He's stressed, Dad. Investors are pressuring him. He says the market's volatile. I nodded. Markets are like tides, I said. You can't control them, only respect them. She didn't understand then, but she would. I remember sitting alone that evening reflecting on the irony of it all. He thought I was outdated because I didn't chase trends. But trends are just circles. What goes up must come down. I thought about how in old European families, fathers would train their heirs, not by giving them wealth, but by denying them comfort. They called it character inheritance, teaching resilience before riches. People still debate whether that's cruel or wise, but I think it's the only true inheritance that lasts. As months passed, his once booming business began showing signs of wear. He still smiled in public, but those who watched closely could see the tension behind his jaw. My daughter's tone changed too. Less laughter, more hesitation. He's traveling a lot, she'd say. Things are just tough right now. I listened without comment, sipping my tea, the same way one observes a storm forming far off at sea. One night I found myself thinking about him not with anger, but pity. It's sad when a man mistakes pride for strength. Pride is fragile. The slightest wind of misfortune can shatter it. Strength is quiet, it bends, adapts, waits. I knew he was heading toward the edge, and though I could have warned him, I didn't. Some lessons can't be taught. They have to be lived. The last time we met before the collapse, he called me unexpectedly to lunch. It was at an expensive restaurant downtown, the kind that served tiny portions for big prices. He greeted me warmly, too warmly. Sir, I've got something amazing for you, he said, showing me documents about a once-in-a-lifetime investment. It was, of course, another high-risk scheme, dressed in glamour. I listened, nodded, and when he was done, I simply said, I'll pass. He blinked, but why I looked him in the eyes. Because I only invest in things that outlive applause. He didn't know how to respond. Silence filled the table, heavy but clean. I stood, thanked him for lunch, and left him sitting there still holding his shiny papers. That was the last time I saw him proud. Sometimes silence isn't avoidance, it's preparation. And as I walked out into the afternoon sun, I knew my silence had already begun, teaching him more than words ever could. The first signs of his fall came quietly, almost politely, like the way autumn announces itself with a single brown leaf before the forest understands what's happening. My daughter called one morning, her voice softer than usual. "Dad, can you come by? He's just going through something. I didn't ask what. I already knew." I could hear it in the tremor of her tone, in the way she avoided the word money. When I arrived, the house looked the same from the outside, grand, polished, self-assured, but inside, something was missing. The air itself felt heavier, as though the walls had begun absorbing secrets. He was sitting in the living room. No suit this time, no watch, no grin, just a man in a crumpled shirt with his fingers pressed to his temples. He looked up when he saw me, and for the first time, he didn't try to act bigger than the moment. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice stripped of arrogance, "we've had setbacks." I sat across from him, saying nothing. "The market turned," he continued. "Investors pulled out. Cash flows tight. It's temporary, of course, just bad timing." He gave a small laugh, but it died in his throat. I nodded slowly. "Timing," I said. "That's the hardest thing to buy." He looked confused, almost pleading for advice, but pride still fought to keep its seat at the table. "You've seen hard times, right?" he asked. "You know how it feels when things slip." I smiled faintly. "Yes," I said. But I also knew when to stop digging. The truth was, I'd been expecting this. I'd seen this story too many times. The fast rise, the denial, the stubborn push forward, and then the inevitable crash. When people build their lives on the illusion of constant growth, they forget that stability is not about moving up, but about knowing when to pause. As weeks passed, the cracks widened. My daughter began coming home more often, the grandchildren tagging along. She'd talk about tight budgets and restructuring words that tried to make disaster sound professional. My wife would nod sympathetically while I listened in silence. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching someone drown in the same pride that once mocked your calmness. There was only confirmation that silence once again had been right. Then came the day the luxury cars disappeared from the driveway. My daughter explained it away at first. "He's cutting expenses," she said, "streamlining." But streamlining doesn't explain the dark circles under her eyes or the foreclosure notice I spotted half-tucked under their mail. I said nothing because sometimes compassion looks like restraint. One evening I received a message from him. "Can we meet?" it said. No exclamation marks this time. Just 3 plain words. We met at a small cafe near the edge of town. He arrived late, his once smooth posture now stiff with fatigue. "It's bad," he admitted quietly, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "The debts, they're worse than I told her. I just need some time to recover." He looked at me, then really looked, not as a rival or an elder to impress, but as a man desperate for understanding. "I know I've said things before," he continued, voice trembling. "Things I shouldn't have, but I never meant disrespect. I was just trying to make something of myself." I nodded slowly. "We all try," I said. "The question is what we're willing to lose in the process." He swallowed hard. "I need a small bridge loan," he said finally. "Just until the deal closes next quarter. After that, I'll pay you back double." And there it was, the moment I had seen coming like a slow train over the years. I watched him struggle between pride and pleading. It's a strange thing to witness the collapse of arrogance. It doesn't explode, it implodes, quietly. "I can't," I said gently. His eyes widened. "What, sir? I'm not asking for charity. Just a loan." I took a breath. "It's not about charity," I said. "It's about lesson." He blinked, confused. "You taught me once that the old ways don't work," I continued. But here you are asking for the same patience and trust those old ways were built on." He didn't speak. His jaw tightened. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice breaking. "This isn't about pride anymore. It's survival." I nodded slowly. "Survival?" I repeated. "Yes. That's what you said at dinner that night. Survival of the smartest. Remember?" He looked down. His silence told me he remembered every word. When I got home that night, my wife was waiting. "Did you help him?" she asked anxiously. I shook my head. "He's not ready to be helped yet." She frowned, tears filling her eyes. "He's our family." I sighed. And family must sometimes feel the ground before they respect the roots. Days later, news of his company's collapse spread. Investors filed suits, employees left, and his image, once polished and perfect, vanished from screens overnight. My daughter came to visit, pale and quiet. "He's not the same," she whispered. "He doesn't sleep. He barely eats." I put my hand on hers. "That's what truth tastes like when you've ignored it too long," I said softly. That evening, I sat on my porch again, watching the sunset melt behind the trees. The air smelled of rain, like it had the night I first realized what kind of man he was. Funny how life always loops back. I thought about how people still debate whether karma exists. To me, it's not mystical or spiritual, it's mathematical. Life always balances the ledger. And in the quiet hum of dusk, I knew the balance had begun. It was raining the night he came. Not the soft, romantic kind of rain you see in movies. This was heavy, impatient, the kind that turns streets into mirrors and exposes every crack in a roof. I was sitting in my armchair reading the paper when I heard the knock. 3 short taps, hesitant. My wife looked up from her knitting. We both knew who it was before I even opened the door. And there he stood, my son-in-law, soaked to the bone, his once tailored jacket clinging to him like defeat. His eyes were swollen not from the rain, but from something older and heavier, shame. For a moment he just stood there, unable to speak. I stepped aside silently. "Come in," I said, my voice steady. He hesitated, then walked in, leaving muddy footprints on the floor he once considered beneath his shoes. My wife gasped softly when she saw him. "Daniel," she said, rushing to fetch a towel. He nodded weakly. "I'm sorry to come like this," he whispered, his voice breaking between words. I didn't know where else to go. I gestured for him to sit. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. Funny how silence becomes louder when guilt enters a room. He sat down slowly, staring at his hands, rubbing them together as if he could erase the past by friction. I poured him tea the same way I did for him years ago, when he first joined our family. Back then, he didn't drink it, said it was too old-fashioned. Tonight, he took it with both hands, as if it were the last warmth left in the world. "I messed up," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's gone, the house, the cars, the business. I can't even pay rent now. My daughter—" He stopped himself, realizing he had said my daughter, about the woman who was my daughter. I let it pass. "She's staying with her mother," he continued. "I didn't want her to see me like this." He looked up then, and for the first time there was no ego, no pride, no mask. Just a man stripped bare by consequence. He pulled out a folder from his bag, damp from the rain. "I need a loan," he said, voice trembling. "Just enough to start over. I've got plans I can rebuild. I'll pay every cent back, please." The word "please" was new from his mouth. It stumbled out awkwardly, like a foreign language. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. The same man who once said I was too simple for this world was now sitting in front of me, humbled by the world's cruelty. "Do you remember," I asked softly, "what you said to me at that dinner years ago about survival?" He looked confused for a second, then realization dawned. "You said humility doesn't pay off," I continued, "that it's a different era and people like me just wait for blessings. Do you still believe that?" He lowered his head. "No, sir," he said quietly. I was wrong. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. "You see," I said, "blessings don't come to those who shout. They come to those who listen when everything else goes silent." I paused. And sometimes the silence is the lesson. He looked at me desperately. "So you'll help me?" The hope in his eyes was painful to watch. For a moment I wanted to. My wife was looking at me too, silently pleading. But I had made my choice long ago, not out of revenge, but principle. "No," I said finally, my voice soft but firm. "I can't." He blinked disbelief, flooding his face. "You can't, or you won't." I met his eyes, both. He stood slowly, the weight of rejection breaking through his composure. "I understand," he said quietly. "I deserve this." He turned toward the door, shoulders slumped. I spoke again, my tone gentler. "Daniel." He stopped. "You don't deserve punishment," I said. "You deserve perspective. I didn't build my life by luck. I built it by losing gracefully and learning when to stop pretending." He didn't say anything, just nodded the smallest movement before walking out into the rain. The door closed softly behind him, but the echo stayed in my chest for hours. My wife sat beside me, tears in her eyes. "You were too harsh," she whispered. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Life's harsh. I just stopped cushioning it for him." That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain was relentless, like it was washing the world clean. I thought about fathers and sons, about pride and mercy. People still debate whether tough love is love at all. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just honesty dressed in disappointment. But I knew deep down that if I helped him now, he'd only fall again later because he hadn't learned how to stand. In the early hours, the rain eased. I went to the window and looked out at the faint glow of dawn breaking over the wet street. The world looked reborn, like even failure could be washed away. Somewhere out there, my son-in-law was walking through the aftermath of his own storm. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or pity. Just peace, because I had given him something money couldn't buy: clarity. The morning after that rain, my house was quieter than usual, as if even the walls knew something irreversible had happened. The sound of water dripping from the eaves mixed with the faint chirping of birds, a kind of reluctant peace after a long storm. My wife barely spoke to me during breakfast. She kept glancing at the front door, half expecting Daniel to return. I could tell she wanted to say something to accuse me of being cold, but she didn't. There are moments when silence becomes heavier than words, when a person realizes that some choices are made not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. After she went to the garden, I sat at the table, hands wrapped around my coffee cup, thinking about that knock from the night before. His face still lingered in my mind, the wet hair clinging to his forehead, the tremble in his voice, the defeated way he looked at me. I wasn't immune to pity. I'm not made of stone. But pity without lesson is poison. It numbs rather than heals. I knew that helping him would be like patching a sinking boat with kindness. It would float for a while, only to drown again. No, I needed him to feel the full weight of consequence, to let silence speak louder than sympathy. A few days passed. My daughter called. Her voice was tense, brittle. "Dad, I know he came to see you," she said. "He told me you refused." I didn't answer right away. "I did?" I said finally. "Why?" she asked, her voice rising. "He's trying, Dad. He's finally humble. Isn't that what you wanted?" I closed my eyes. "No, child," I said softly. I didn't want him humble for a moment. I wanted him changed for life. She sighed sharply. You sound cruel. I exhaled slowly. Maybe. But cruelty without intention is punishment. Cruelty with purpose is wisdom. She didn't respond, only said, He's broken. You could have helped. I wanted to tell her that sometimes breaking is the only way a person learns the shape of their own strength. But she hung up before I could. That night I sat outside on the porch again. The air smelled of damp earth and jasmine. I thought about all the times I had been silent when he mocked me. People often mistake silence for weakness, but I see it differently. Silence is the pause before understanding. It's the moment the world holds its breath to see what kind of person you are, without noise. People still debate whether silence fixes or destroys relationships. I think it does both. It ends false ones and strengthens real ones. Days turned into weeks. My wife eventually forgave me, though she didn't say it aloud. She showed it in small ways, placing my favorite tea on the table, resting her hand on my shoulder while passing by. My daughter, however, stayed distant. She came less often, and when she did, her visits were short and full of strained politeness. I missed her laughter, but I knew she was processing pain, not just from me, but from the man she married. Pain teaches even if it arrives wearing the face of disappointment. Then one afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges, I saw him again from a distance, standing at the end of the street. He looked thinner, older. His clothes hung loose, his hair unkempt. He stood there for a long moment, watching our house, but didn't move closer. Perhaps he was gathering courage, or perhaps he just wanted to see if we still lived in peace, while he lived in chaos. I didn't wave. I didn't call out. I simply watched him turn away and disappear down the road. Sometimes the most powerful gesture isn't reaching out, it's standing still and letting someone realize what they've lost. A week later, I received a letter, handwritten. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. It was from Daniel. Sir, I don't expect forgiveness or help. I just want you to know that I understand now. The life I built was never mine. It was borrowed from the illusion of success. I used to laugh at your simplicity, thinking it was ignorance. Now I see it was wisdom. I thought power came from having more, but it comes from needing less. Thank you for saying no. That silence changed me more than money ever could. I read it twice, then a third time. The words sank deep like rain seeping into dry soil. My wife read it too, her eyes welling up. Maybe he's learning, she whispered. I nodded, maybe. After that, I didn't hear from him for months. My daughter still came occasionally, quieter than before, but less angry. She told me Daniel was working small jobs trying to repay debts. He'd sold everything, the cars, the watches, even his expensive suits. He walks to work now, she said. Sometimes he takes the bus. I smiled faintly. Then he's finally seeing the world at human speed. She frowned, not sure if I was mocking or reflecting. Do you think he'll make it? She asked. I shrugged. That depends on whether he listens to silence or runs from it. One evening near sunset, I found myself standing in front of my old workshop again. The smell of wood and oil filled the air. I thought about Daniel, about the young version of myself who once thought simplicity was weakness too. Maybe life is a circle after all, each generation mocking the one before until they live long enough to become it. I brushed dust off an old tool and smiled. You see, I murmured to the empty room, the simple old man wasn't so simple after all. Months passed and seasons changed. The world kept spinning, but something inside me settled. My silence had spoken, and it had been heard. That realization carried a strange peace, not triumph, not revenge, just quiet resolution. My wife noticed it too. You look lighter, she said one morning. I chuckled. Maybe I've finally stopped carrying his lessons. One day, as winter began to thaw, there was another knock at the door. This time it was my daughter, and behind her Daniel. But he was different. His eyes, though tired, carried softness. He wore a plain coat, the kind that doesn't demand attention. His hands, once manicured and delicate, now had the roughness of work. He bowed slightly. "Sir," he said quietly, "I came to return something." He held out an envelope. Inside was a small sum money he must have scraped together from whatever job he now held. "You never lent me anything," I said, confused. He nodded. "No, but I borrowed your patience. Consider this a token of thanks." My wife began to cry softly. I looked at him for a long time, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keep it," I said. "You've already repaid me with silence." He looked stunned, but then he smiled a real smile, the first one I'd ever seen on him without performance. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not saving me when I wanted to be saved." After they left, I sat on the porch again, watching the sky turn orange. The world seemed quieter, lighter, even the wind gentler. I thought about all that had happened, how mockery turned into humility, how pride dissolved into peace. And I realized something I wish I'd known earlier. Forgiveness doesn't always come through words. Sometimes it's found in the space between actions. The silence that lingers after pain has finished teaching. People still debate whether silence heals or kills. Maybe it does both. But that night, as the stars emerged one by one, I understood that my silence hadn't just punished him, it had freed me. Because letting go of anger is the final act of quiet strength. I smiled to myself, the old kind of smile that carries both sadness and gratitude. The simple old man had won not by wealth, not by revenge, but by waiting long enough for the world to catch up to his pace. And in that long, gentle silence, I finally felt what true victory sounds like. When word spread through the family that Daniel had come back and made peace, the reactions were mixed like a storm, half rain, half sunshine. My wife cried with relief, finally seeing what she'd prayed for through so many sleepless nights. My daughter, though still fragile from the years of tension, seemed lighter, almost reborn. But the rest of the family, the cousins, the uncles, the ones who always watched from a safe distance, reacted as families often do, with gossip disguised as concern. Some said I was too cruel to him. Others said I was too soft in the end. People love to measure your choices, especially when they didn't have to live them. A few evenings later, we gathered for dinner again, our first full family meal in years. The same table that had once echoed with laughter and arrogance now felt different, softer. The air was heavier with reflection than noise. Daniel arrived early wearing a modest shirt, the same one he'd worn when he came to return that envelope. He greeted me first, quietly, respectfully. No handshake of dominance this time, just a bow of gratitude. My wife smiled through tears. My daughter sat beside him, their fingers brushing like two people relearning the language of love. As we ate, conversations started carefully like children testing frozen ground. But soon laughter returned this time. Gentle, genuine. The kind that doesn't need to be loud to feel alive. I watched Daniel as he served my wife a plate, then turned to me. "Sir, may I pour you tea?" he asked. The room went still for a second. That simple gesture, the same one he once mocked as too old-fashioned, hit everyone differently. My wife smiled proudly. My daughter squeezed his hand under the table. Even I, who had vowed never to gloat, felt the edges of a smile forming. "Of course," I said softly. "Just the way I like it, plain, no sugar." As the night went on, someone brought up the past. My cousin, who always enjoyed stirring conversation, leaned forward. "So, Daniel," he said, "I heard you hit rock bottom before making your big comeback. What did that teach you?" The question hung in the air like a test. Daniel didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of his tea, then said, "It taught me that silence can be louder than advice." Everyone looked puzzled. He continued, "When my father-in-law said no, I thought he was punishing me. But now I know he was protecting me from myself." He looked at me. Then, eyes steady. He didn't give me money. He gave me consequence. And that saved me. I could feel eyes turning toward me, some admiring, some skeptical. My cousin laughed lightly. "That's one way to look at it," he said. "But not everyone believes in tough love." I smiled. "That's fine," I said calmly. "People debate whether discipline is love or cruelty. But in my experience, love without accountability breeds arrogance, and arrogance kills faster than hunger." The table went quiet. My wife looked at me with pride. My daughter reached over and gently touched my hand, a silent apology for all the months she blamed me. Later that night, after everyone left, my daughter stayed behind. The children had fallen asleep in the living room, curled up like tiny bundles of peace. Daniel was helping clean the dishes, something he'd never done before. "Dad," she said quietly, "I want to say thank you." I looked up. "For what?" She smiled sadly. "For not helping him." I raised an eyebrow. "That's not something I expected to hear." She shrugged. "If you had, he'd still be the same man, maybe worse, and I'd still be pretending everything was fine." I felt a lump in my throat but said nothing. She leaned closer. "You know," she whispered, "he told me something the other night. He said he used to think you were the weakest man he knew. Now he thinks you're the strongest." I chuckled softly. "Strength isn't about being loud," I said. "It's about standing still when the world demands you bend." A few weeks later, Daniel asked if he could come to my workshop. I hadn't invited him, but I didn't refuse either. When he arrived, he walked around slowly, touching the old tools, the rough wooden benches, the dust that never quite leaves. "This place," he said quietly, "it feels alive." I nodded. "It is. Everything here has been touched by failure and patience. That's what makes it alive." He looked at me with a small smile. "I wish I'd learned this earlier." We worked side by side that day, fixing a broken chair. He listened carefully when I explained how to sand the edges, how to measure twice before cutting once. For the first time, his hands trembled, not from insecurity, but from respect for precision. I realized then that he wasn't just fixing a chair, he was rebuilding himself piece by piece with humility as his new tool. When we finished, he turned to me. "Sir," he said, "do you ever regret saying no?" I paused, wiping my hands on a rag. "Every day," I said. "But I'd regret it even more if I'd said yes." He nodded slowly, understanding. That evening, he and my daughter stayed for dinner again. The children played in the yard, the house filled with warmth that had been missing for so long. As I watched them, I thought about how life had come full circle. The man who once laughed at my simplicity now sought peace in it. The woman who once defended his pride now admired his humility. And I, the so-called simple old man, had learned something too, that silence may build lessons, but forgiveness builds bridges. People still debate whether family wounds ever truly heal. Some say time heals them. Others say time only hides them. I think healing begins when one person stops demanding to be right. That night, as we all sat together, I realized I didn't need an apology anymore. Watching him help my wife set the table was enough. His actions spoke in a language louder than any words he could say. Before leaving, Daniel turned to me once more. "Sir," he said, "I want to earn your trust, not just your forgiveness." I nodded. "Trust is simple," I replied. You don't earn it with promises, you maintain it with silence and consistency. He smiled faintly. Then I'll stay quiet and keep showing up. After they left, I walked outside, breathing in the cool night air. The stars were bright, clearer than they'd been in years. My wife came beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "You were right," she whispered. "Silence really does speak." I chuckled. "Yes," I said softly, "but only if the listener is finally ready to hear." In the months that followed, Daniel and I grew closer, not as rivals or opposites, but as two men separated by time and now reunited by understanding. We didn't talk much about the past. We didn't need to. The lesson had already been lived. My daughter's laughter returned lighter now, no longer forced. The grandchildren came over more often, filling the house with noise that didn't irritate me anymore. It was the right kind of noise, the sound of a family reborn. One afternoon, as we all sat in the garden sharing fruit and stories, my wife looked at me and said, "See? The simple old man fixed it all in the end." I laughed quietly. "No," I said, "life fixed it. I just stayed out of its way. And maybe that's the truest wisdom age brings. You stop trying to control the outcome and start trusting the rhythm of consequence. Because in the end, every insult fades, every grudge weakens, but the lessons that silence teaches, they echo forever. Time, when it heals, does not announce itself. It doesn't knock on the door or ask permission to enter it, simply starts breathing softer around the wounds until they stop hurting. That's how the next chapter of my family began. Not with a grand reconciliation or emotional speech, but with mornings that finally felt peaceful again. Daniel started visiting regularly, not out of guilt anymore, but gratitude. My daughter's eyes shone brighter. Her laughter came more easily, and even my wife, who had once accused me of cruelty, looked at me now with quiet respect. It wasn't the kind of peace you celebrate. It was the kind you protect. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel arrived earlier than usual, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. He looked different, not richer, not poorer, but grounded. "Sir," he said with a steady tone, "I've been saving for something. It's not much, but it's from work that's honest." He placed the box on the table and stepped back. Inside, I found a handmade wooden clock. It wasn't perfect. The edges were slightly uneven, but I recognized the craftsmanship. "You made this?" I asked. He nodded. "Every piece. Took me weeks." The clock ticked softly every second, steady and sure, like his voice. "I wanted to give you something that measures time," he said, "because time was what you gave me the time to change." I didn't say anything for a long moment. My throat felt tight the way it does when words can't keep up with meaning. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "You don't owe me anything," I said quietly. He smiled faintly. "That's the point. I finally understand that." My wife, standing nearby, was already crying, her tears falling onto the clock as if baptizing it into our story. That evening after they left, I sat alone with that clock ticking on the table. The sound filled the room like a heartbeat. I thought about how everything had come full circle, from mockery to respect, from pride to humility, from silence to understanding. And I realized something deeper. I hadn't just taught him a lesson. He had taught me one too. For all my patience, for all my wisdom, I had been proud too in my own quiet way. Proud of my restraint, proud of being the better man. But pride, even in silence, is still pride. Watching him rebuild himself without bitterness showed me that forgiveness isn't a gift you give others. It's the final step in freeing yourself. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed again. Daniel found stable work managing a small carpentry business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. He'd stop by every now and then to bring fresh fruit tools or sometimes just to share a cup of tea. We didn't talk about success or money anymore. Instead, we talked about things that actually mattered: how the children were growing, how the garden was flourishing, how peace feels heavier but kinder than ambition. He once said, "I used to think wealth was what people saw when they looked at you. Now I think it's what stays when they look away." I smiled and told him, "You've learned faster than I did." People still debated my choice within the extended family. Some praised my wisdom, others called it cruelty, dressed as discipline. But I stopped listening to those voices. Life had already proven the truth. And the truth was simple. No one changes because of what you give them. They change because of what you refuse to give until they're ready to deserve it. One evening, we all gathered again for dinner, this time at my house. The grandchildren ran around chasing fireflies, while my wife hummed an old tune in the kitchen. Daniel was helping me fix a loose chair leg on the porch. The sun was setting and the sky looked like it was painted with gold dust. He looked at me and said quietly, "You know, I used to be afraid of silence. Now I look for it." I chuckled. "That's how you know you've grown up. When silence stops being punishment and becomes peace." He smiled. "I think I understand that now." After dinner, as the night grew darker and laughter filled the room, I realized how rare it is for a family to return to warmth after breaking. We don't often get second chances at respect. When we lose it, it usually stays gone. But here, somehow, it had returned not through confrontation, but through patience. And that made it sacred. Later that night, after everyone had left, I walked through the quiet house, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, the objects that had survived the storms of years. I stopped by the clock Daniel had made. It ticked steadily, unwavering. That sound felt like closure. It reminded me that time itself had sided with me, not because I was right, but because I waited. I sat down by the window, the same spot where I had once stared into the rain when he first came begging for help. The same world, but a different peace. I remembered every stage of this journey: the humiliation, the silence, the fall, the refusal, the knock at the door, and finally the transformation. It all made sense now. Life is never about proving who's stronger. It's about knowing when to hold still and let truth reveal itself. People still debate whether humility is strength or surrender. To me, it's both. It takes strength to surrender pride, and it takes humility to stay strong when everyone misunderstands you. The world worships noise titles, wealth, applause. But the older I get, the more I realize that peace is earned in quiet choices. A few months later, Daniel and my daughter surprised me with an anniversary dinner. It wasn't lavish, just a meal in their small home, but the love in that room was priceless. Daniel toasted softly, his voice steady. "To the man who taught me that losing everything can sometimes be the only way to gain myself." Everyone raised their glasses. I didn't. I simply smiled and said, "To time and the silence it took to make this moment possible." After dinner, as I prepared to leave, Daniel walked me to the car. The air was cool, the streetlights gentle. He looked at me one last time and said, "Sir, I'll never forget that night you said no." I looked back at him and replied, "Good, because sometimes the hardest word is the one that saves you." He nodded, his eyes glistening. I didn't understand then, but now I see it wasn't about money. It was about meaning. As I drove home under the slow rhythm of that handmade clock ticking in my mind, I realized something I hadn't said aloud before. My son-in-law wasn't just forgiven, he was transformed. And so was I. The simple old man I once pretended to be had grown too, not richer, not wiser, but freer. In the end, peace doesn't come when others change. It comes when you stop needing them to. Respect doesn't return through words, but through the quiet rebuilding of trust, one small gesture at a time. And family survives not through wealth or legacy, but through the courage to forgive what once broke it. That night before sleeping, I looked at the clock one last time. Each tick felt like a heartbeat from another chance life had given us. The lesson was complete, not through triumph, but through quiet endurance. I whispered to the stillness around me, "You see, son, even the simplest man can outlast pride if he just learns how to wait." And with that, I turned off the light, listening to the soft ticking of time, no longer as a reminder of what was lost, but as a promise of what had finally been found. When I look back now, I realize that life was never about who won the arguments or who had more to show. It was about who stayed true when pride tried to rewrite love. I used to think silence was something you gave when you had no words left, but now I know it's what you use when words would only cheapen the truth. Daniel's journey, my daughter's pain, my wife's tears, all of it shaped a story that could only be written in time, not spoken in haste. I tell you this tonight, not as a man who seeks sympathy, but as one who found meaning in stillness. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't giving someone what they want, it's giving them the space to become who they need to be. It took years, mistakes, and one rain-soaked knock at the door for me to understand that forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. So, if you're listening to this, sitting somewhere with your own silence pressing on your chest, remember, not every goodbye is final, and not every no is cruel. Sometimes it's the only bridge strong enough to lead two people back to respect. Hey, thank you for staying with me through this story. You probably felt some of those silences yourself, the ones that sting, then heal. I hope tonight's tale reminded you that patience isn't weakness, and that time, when paired with love, can fix even the deepest cracks in a family. If you enjoyed this moment of quiet truth, take a breath, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I'd love to know, have you ever had to teach someone through silence? Good night, my friends. Sleep softly and let your peace speak louder than your pride.